Welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. I'm your host, Andrew Soren. In this episode, I'm joined by Steve Taylor, professor of leadership and creativity at the WPI Business School and a longtime voice in the field of organizational aesthetics. You heard me right. Steve's work sits at an unusual intersection of leadership, ethics, and the arts. He explores how we actually experience work, not just cognitively, but through our senses, our bodies, and our relationships with others. We talk about why meaningful work is not only something we need to think about, but something we need to feel. We explore how art, craft, and aesthetic judgment can help leaders see complexity more clearly, navigate power more thoughtfully, and stay connected to what matters in everyday practice. This conversation invites a different way of knowing work, one that values discernment, reflection, and the courage to not always have the answer. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Steve Taylor, welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. I'm very glad to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Steve, I think that we're going to have a conversation today about organizational aesthetics, and we'll probably have to start by defining what on earth we mean by that. But maybe before we get into that, I'll ask you to just briefly introduce yourself and maybe tell listeners what makes your work meaningful.
Sure. I'm Steve Taylor, and my day job is as a professor of leadership and creativity at the business school at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where I've been since 2002. And I say day job because deep down, I'm a playwright. Turns out I've made some money in my life, but never enough to support myself as a playwright. So I've always needed a day job. And what makes my work meaningful? I think it's a really hard question, but I would say, I think of the points that strike me as particularly meaningful. The thing that comes up the most is actually in teaching, and it's working with students and seeing student growth. That we have a program at WPI where the students do a project in their junior year that has to involve the social implications of technology. The idea being we're a technical school, we're producing technologists, but they should understand something about the social implications and social context the technology exists within. And these projects are big projects. They're equal to about 4.5 classes worth of work. And there's a preparation for it. And then they work full time on the project for a term, which for us is 7 weeks. Often overseas, we have 50 project centers around the world. I watch them like that thing. Last one I did one a couple years ago. I was advising in Bangkok. And the students come and when they first get there, they're like, "Oh, I don't even know I can't read the signs. I can't do anything." And if they feel a little ill, they need help. And within a very short time, they suddenly have expanded where they have confidence about acting in the world. And they figure out how to figure things out and how to work together. And just the growth of them as humans over that 7 weeks is amazing to watch. And to me, that's probably the most meaningful work I end up doing.
I love that answer. It makes me think about another episode of this podcast we did probably close to a year ago with Shige Oishi, and Shige is a happiness researcher who spent his whole entire lifetime studying happiness, and kind of decided there's usually two main ways that people think about happiness, either as kind of pleasure or as purpose. Those are the kind of two major ways. And he was like, there's always a third thing that seems missing to me, and he called that psychological richness. And terms abroad are great examples of psychological richness. It's not always pleasurable by any stretch of the imagination to do that kind of traveling, that kind of exploration. And it's not always necessarily meaningful, but there's this sense of adventure, this sense of possibility of discovery, of growth, of openness that is this amazing gateway to well-being that I think few of us take as seriously as we probably should. I think that the arts is actually a big part of what psychological richness is all about. I think Shige would absolutely agree.
And when you say psychological richness, I thought one of the things that's going on there that makes the meaningful work meaningful is connection with other people and the
Mm.
connection with students is in a variety of ways. It happens like when you're working full time together and you're having meals together and such. It becomes the connection becomes much deeper when when some student is having an allergic reaction and you have to go to the local hospital. A lot of meaningfulness is about finding connection in the world. Even the research when someone says,
Mm.
"Oh, your stuff resonated with me," it's like, "Oh, somebody I'd never met in another half of the world connected with something I wrote." So there's a little bit of a moment of connection there.
One of the founders of the science of well-being, his name was Chris Peterson, said that you could probably reduce the whole entire field to one statement, and it's that other people matter to our well-being. That sense of connection is massive. But talking about connection, I feel like one of the things that you've done in your career is create a connection between art and aesthetics and organizations or business scholarship. Um, Tell us a little bit about that. How did you get there from being a playwright to that?
When I went to do my doctorate, I was going to study playwriting or actually performance studies, but I couldn't get any funding. And it turned out one of the local schools, Boston College, had a PhD in organizational studies about transformational change. When I went and talked to the guy who was running the program at the time, was a guy named Bill Torbert, and we talked about it. And he talked about his experience for having done this thing he called the theater of inquiry, and it seemed like there was some real interesting possibilities there. And so I applied for it, and they gave me funding. So there I was studying as a grad student again. We do the qualifiers in the first year, and then do this kind of intense research project in the second year, and then finally in the second year you get to take a break, get to breathe a little bit. And so the first thing I did was write a play to try to make sense of the last 2 years of my life, and that play was called "Capitalist Pigs," and it kind of actually recapitulates the history of organizational behavior in the course over the course of the play. Like there's a point where the pigs are doing they're turning the lights on and off to see if it makes them more efficient. And once I'd written it, I showed it to some people. I showed it to Bill Torbert in particular, and he looked at it and he goes, "Oh, you should submit this to the Academy of Management." I was like, "Really? It's a play?" And he convinced me. I talked to some other people, and so I submitted it as a symposium. And I wrote up a little bit of academic thing around it, how and kind of was kind of sort of tongue in cheek, and I said, "Oh, it's aesthetic theorizing as opposed to intellectual theorizing."
Hmm.
And I wasn't completely serious when I said it, but I wrote this little, and I had some various academic sites for it and all, and it got accepted. We did a symposium where we did a stage reading of the play, followed by a discussion about it.
Wow.
And suddenly, I was the guy who did plays at the Academy of Management and many and other conferences over time. I wrote plays where I had organizational issues and did stage readings of them. Because when I did my master's, I had actually part of my master's program had been about how to direct staged readings in particular and how to use actors to develop plays. Those things kind of came together for me in that particular way. While at the same time, I constantly people said, well, if you have a background in theater, you should be, drawing all this organization as theater. And I was like, well, that's completely uninteresting to me because the metaphor is kind of so obvious in some ways. I just had no interest in that, but I did have really interest in using the arts and arts-based approaches. And then the other thing that happened was in my second year research project, I've been collecting these stories of organizational change. And I've been working with my advisor, Steve Borgatti, and he said, well, what's interesting about the stories you've heard? And I said, well, what's really interesting is like this one particular story is great. And these other stories are horrible. And eventually the thing I came to is, and he says, you can't just say it's good or bad. You have to have some explanation of it. And I was like, it's just completely about an aesthetic form and response about the
Hmm.
story itself. So I became interested in the sort of the aesthetics of the story. more so than the content, which eventually my dissertation that I did was then called The Aesthetics of Leadership Storytelling, which didn't work particularly well, but it got me thinking about the aesthetic of various aspects of organizational life and how I would think about those and to the degree which I thought they mattered a lot. And they hadn't been talked about a lot. This was the 1990s, so it was just starting to happen. I think the very first article on organizational aesthetics in a mainstream journal was Antonio Strati in 1992 or 93. He had a piece in the Academy Management Review. And then there was another few pieces in a small obscure journal in Europe. And I think by the time I was doing my dissertation, my literature review, I think there were like 6 articles in existence on organizational aesthetics. So there
Wow.
was few things to point at, but very little.
And that was like close to 30 years ago now.
Yeah.
How has it changed? How has this field of organizational aesthetics evolved?
Well, I'd say it's actually now become an actual field. I think in 2004, I wrote a piece with Hans Hansen called Finding Form, which was a review of the field at that time. And I think we included probably pretty much absolutely everything we could find that had been written. I'm now working with Matt Stadler. We're in the production process on a research handbook on organizational aesthetics. And we're limited to like at most like 40 chapters. And it was hard to get it down to which 40 people to ask. So it's really blossomed. There's, I wouldn't say it's mainstream, but it's recognized as an actual thing now.
That's great. Well, I now have a whole bunch of questions that I'm curious about asking, and maybe we can take some of the ways within the you sent me the introduction to the research handbook, and so there's some different ways in which you've categorized the ways that this field has grown up. Some of which you've just talked about right now, but maybe the one that I'd love to start with is sensory knowing. This idea that sometimes we understand. I mean, you're talking about kind of research methods, and to a certain extent, like we can think that we know the world cognitively, but you suggest that the arts gives us tools to be able to understand with our senses before we necessarily understand with our minds. So, like, how does that shift our understanding to the way that we might work or lead in meaningful ways?
I think it's probably important to start with where the field of organizational aesthetics really comes from as what it's based in. Because aesthetics means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. There's often this fairly shallow meaning of it means, oh, appearance, or other people might say, oh, it means beauty. So for the field, it really goes back to Baumgarten. So back in the 1600s, there was the 30-year war in Europe. And basically the Protestants and Catholics were killing each other in the millions. And various people thought this was kind of horrible. One of them being Rene Descartes. And Descartes famously said, I think, therefore I am. Reason is what makes us human. It's all about reason and intellectual knowing, essence of humanity. And that made a lot of sense in response to the 30 Years' War. But about 100 years later, Alexander Baumgarten and other people like Vico doing similar work, Baumgarten said, well, logic is like the study of intellectual knowing. And that's one way we know, but that's not the only way we know things. We actually know things through sensory knowing, through the direct experience of our senses. And he said, in the study of that direct experience of our senses, I will call aesthetics. Because in
Hmm.
the Greek, aesthetics, aesthesis goes back to senses and sensation. That's sort of the epistemological difference that the field of organizational aesthetics sits on by and large. And the thing that is very clear now in the worlds of neuroscience and embodied cognition and all that stuff is that sensory knowing comes first. We first get in evidence from our senses. And the first way we make sense of it is in terms of a sense, what Klaus Springborg calls a sensory template, or what the embodied cognition people would call a simulation. But we first understand it in direct sensory terms. So even very complex ideas first come out to us in this base sensory mode. Based on that sensory template, we then start to have we have an emotional response to that. And then on that emotional response, we have some cognitions, some, more intellectual stuff, all of which, of course, happens almost instantly. I'll make a brief digression again. Klaus took for his dissertation, he asked people who had unsolvable problems to come work with him. And so they were basically managers with unsolvable problems. And we worked with them. He had them take pictures that reminded them of their unsolvable problem. Then they talked about those pictures and they determined what the sensory template was, what the sensory feeling of that was. And then usually there was at least one picture out of like 30 that was completely different. And talk about, well, what's that one about? And that was a different sensory template for understanding the same situation. And if the managers could shift their sensory template, usually the problem dissolved. It was no longer a problem from that new sensory template. It's a fascinating thing how much, or how much our cognition, how much of our understanding of the world gets based in this initial sensory feeling. Yeah, and we have
Yeah.
typically in organizations focused on intellectual knowing, particularly intellectual
Mhm.
knowing that we can quantify. We've, there was a movement a few years back to say, well, we need to have an emotional intelligence to be able to understand emotions. Natalie Cortell in her book talks about having a sensory intelligence or sensory
Mhm.
quotient and be able to talk about the actual sensory experience in organizations, which I think is foundational and sits below that emotional level. And
Mhm.
that's certainly a level which we don't get at. We don't talk about much. We don't talk about our direct sense, in part because it's usually pretty hard to talk about. We can communicate it through more presentational forms, through arts-based methods.
I'm struck by this, this whole notion of, we sense things first before we necessarily think of them is, there's this, in all of the literature that I've read around meaningful work and all the conversations that I've had on this podcast, there's been very, very few people who have started the question of, well, what makes meaningful work based on how do we sense that? It's almost always a cognitive process. What makes work significant and worthwhile for people? It's what's your sense of purpose? Where's congruence? Where's this kind of idea of being able to have significance in our occupational experiences? And yet it is so true that is a felt thing so much more so than it is a cognitive thing, and it's much easier in some ways for somebody to even just feel a sense of attunement. Is something resonant or dissonant? Where does that show up in your body in an embodied cognition way? And yet very, very few people ever talk about it.
Yeah, well, I think the world, the people who sort of fetishize craft talk about it a lot.
Mm,
The book
mm,
Craft is Crawford's book, Shop Class as Soul Craft. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. All ones who fetishize
sure.
hands-on direct craftiness. That's about a sensory, touching, making. Meaningfulness is directly tied to that, almost completely independent of cognition in an awful lot of craft and making sort of literature.
So then let's talk about that. Let's talk about kind of art or making as a way of knowing. How does that potentially help us explore meaning in our lives and our work, in ways that just conventional logic or just thinking it through might not?
Well, I'll tell you two stories that are very much the same story from different directions. In 1991 or thereabouts, I got laid off from my job. I was a manager of consulting services for a small software company. I got laid off and I was completely unexpected. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before. And the first thing I did was at the time I was working on my master's in theater. I came back and within a few weeks I wrote a scene that was about getting laid off. And to me, it captured the felt experience of it. I was like, ah. And then I realized that from that scene, I wrote a whole play based on that play. I realized that was the second act of a play. So then I went back and wrote the first act. And the whole thing is called Soft Targets. It helped me very much emotionally go, oh, this is what was going on and get it out there. So, like, for me, I write plays about my personal experiences. It allows me to get it out of my body and out there in the world. Art allows you to make your feelings object in the world so you can see them and others can see them. But just you being able to see them rather than
Mm.
having to kind of guess what they are inside is enormously valuable. It's the basis of most of art therapy is can we get that stuff out there so we can look at it. Having said that, there are of course two types of art therapy. There's a type that you do the art and you get it out there and you go, oh, the art product tells us all about what's going on inside. The other just says, well, just making art is good. It's therapeutic in a way that we maybe don't really understand, but it is. So let's just make some art. And I think both are true. But to finish the story about the writing the layoff scene, 10 years later, I did some cognitive analysis using a technique called the learning pathways grid, which comes out of the action science world, to analyze what was going on in the layoff and why it was upset me so much. And there I got cognitive understanding about what I was really most mad about was my own response to being laid off, not so much the fact of getting laid off. So for me, it took both the artistic response to my work and as well as the cognitive work. And I say that in
Mm.
case I did the artistic work first and then did the cognitive work. But in terms of my experience more recently of having been dean of the business school, I was interim dean for 2.5 years. I did the cognitive work first. I tried to understand what was going on in terms of being dean. And I wrote what I published as an editorial called Only Connect Confessions of a Reluctant Leader, which ended up being like an 80,000 word editorial in organizational aesthetics, in which I try to kind of intellectually make sense of my experience of being dean and trying to lead. And I try to create some models around connection and all. And that didn't do it for me. It didn't quite resolve things. And I didn't resolve things until I managed to write this monologue about the experience. It's called The Death of a Professor, the unbearable heaviness of being a middle manager. And when wrote that was like, and then I performed it a couple times in front of people. I was like, now I figured it out and I'm come to terms with it. The,
There's a recording that Steve has of him reading this piece, which is terrific, and we'll make sure that we link to it on our show notes for folks who might wanna be able to listen.
because one of the interesting that happens if you do art, if you do it all competently, is you've produced something, you don't necessarily know what it means. You don't know what it's about. I wrote Death of a Professor, and I was pretty convinced by the end of it. I said, "Oh, this is about that experience of continually being in crisis, having a crisis, attacking the crisis, not being able to solve the problem before the next crisis comes along, and you're suddenly on the next problem. And you don't really solve that one, and then you're on the next one. You don't really solve that one." And that was kind of my experience of being middle manager. And then I was rehearsing it before I did it at the Art of Management Organization conference in 2024 in Nancy, and I was doing a rehearsal with Piers Ibbotson. He's a wonderfully talented theater director. I mean, then when he goes, "Wow, this really makes the point that if you're in a position of significant leadership, a significant position of leadership for any length of period of time, at some point you will have to hurt people." Then he made the astute comment. He goes, "Which would explain why, as you go up levels in organizations, you get much higher a higher rate of sociopathy in the leaders." The farther up you go, the higher rates you get. He said, "Because who wants to hurt people?" I was like, wow.
Sad statement, and possibly, spells a need for why the arts should be involved in other things like leadership development, which maybe we'll get to in a second. But before we do, I think, and I've seen and experienced this in my own life, that the arts can also be used, or maybe aesthetics can be used as an opportunity to reframe things that we often just have to do in organizational contexts, things like strategy or infrastructure, or even just the way that we think about time in organizational contexts. And so I'm curious how you've seen that, how does an aesthetic lens actually turn something that is, just business as usual into something that's surprisingly or potentially much more deeply human?
Well, yeah, I think, and again, I use arts a lot in my teaching. And I think what it allows people to connect to places. And this is partly, I teach mostly technical people, mostly engineers, software developers, scientists. And we use the arts, and I think they're not quite ready for it. The wonderful thing about my student audience is they are courageous, more courageous than they know, and they often are totally unprepared. They're not very good at the touchy-feely side of things and at getting there, and the arts will often just get them there in ways that wipe them out. They're just
Mm.
overwhelmingly powerful. So I know firsthand the experience of the arts being like a really kind of dangerous. I did have a group once where one student just lost it. It took them to a deep place, and luckily it was a sort of work where, I always kind of have somebody around who can get them to a therapist, or it's only happened once in like the last 25 years that I've had somebody really lose it because it just took them to, I didn't really know what place it was taking them to, but it was clearly not good. The arts can do that. They can, it's a sharp knife that will penetrate deeply, and that can be wonderful.
What are some of the ways that you've seen the arts used? And let's just use leadership development as a classic example. That's certainly places where I've seen the arts used, or at least attempted to be used in various ways. What are the ways that you've seen it that have led to true transformation?
I use a lot of Keith Johnstone's status work. I think in theater, status is something you do. And I think it captures the essence of the microdynamics of power interactions. And I've had students who say that, "Oh, I get it now. I've been constantly lowering my own status unconsciously in these situations." And it's totally changed how they interact with other people. The ability to actually pay it. And status is something, since we all do it all the time. Within an hour or two, you can learn how to recognize it and read it and enact it differently enough to be able to just completely change how you pay attention to things in the world, how you pay attention to all those small status moves we make all the time, and how you can then choose when you want to enact higher status or lower status. When when you have a subordinate you're talking to and you go, gosh, I want them to open up and talk to me. So I'm not going to sit up here on a higher level than them. I'm actually going to lower myself. So I'm slightly physically lower to them, and I'm going to open in a way, and I'm going to do some low status physicality. It's and it works. That it is, to me, the essence of what a lot of the best use of arts based work does, which is to take the insights the arts have developed about human behavior. And acting is one of those things where there are lots and lots of insight, because to my mind, one way I describe acting is about consciously producing all that subconscious crap that's going on all the time. Because if it's not real to you, you don't have necessarily have all that subconscious baggage and stuff happening, but you need to produce it so that it looks real. So the read it is authentic. So you need to consciously do things to produce all that subconscious stuff, which means you have a whole lot of insight into all that subconscious stuff, like status, like little microdynamics of power. And if you can, so you can take techniques from the arts like that and start to apply, bring them out into the rest of the world, and it's tremendously beneficial. Another one from,
Hmm.
again, acting that I use all the time that I think has an enormous impact on people is to name the actions. This goes back to Stanislavski. He said, the verb, the action, that's what we need to see. But you can sit in a business meeting and just name the actions and have a totally different understanding of what's going on. And you can name the actions, you can then build stuff like the difficult conversation stuff where they talk about separating impact from intent, and then name, oh, that I think that was their intent and that was the impact. And if you just focus on verbs in the way that people in theater focus on verbs, and you will understand what's happening in meetings and human interactions so much better. And in a way that is actionable, because you can then do something about it. Arts in that way, actually, I think, really help us complexify human interaction and be able to grasp and deal with human interaction as an incredibly complex thing.
Talking about complexity, are there ways that the arts are exploited in organizational contexts?
Oh, I think so. I think anytime managers and organizations have presented them with a nice sharp tool, they're happy to use it for their own capitalist purposes. So I think there's definitely, I think it gets used all the time, to the point where, like, Augusto Blau famously has, with his theater, The Oppressed, and all of his work, said it should never be used in organizations and businesses. And he
Mm.
says, he just goes, "I don't want to support, those evil capitals. It's about liberation." To the point where there's a lot of groups that use his work in organizations. And there was this one in Denmark called the Capo Theater that had worked specifically with him, and he basically cut them off and disowned them because they were working with businesses with those evil capitalists. There's certainly ways in which art gets used in ways it wasn't intended, and I say that, but I don't want to imply I have any view of arts as like pure and above worldly use and all. I think art has always been political, has always been instrumentalized, has always been used for things.
Yeah, to a certain extent, we want to be able to be to art has the power to reveal, those
Yes.
things in ways that can be extraordinarily
That's
helpful.
the thing that happens in organizations that they often organizations can sign up for some sort of like, we'll do some sort of artistic intervention, and stuff comes out and they're like, "But that's not what we wanted to learn."
It's what needed to be learned.
And
Yeah.
most artistic uh, arts-based processes, if you talk to like trainers and stuff and leadership developer people who do a lot of that and a lot of it more conventional work, they'll say, well, the amount of sort of processing time when you use the arts-based stuff is much bigger. There's just a whole lot more to process and figure out what's going on. And you don't really, there's just a whole lot more ambiguity. You don't know where you're going to end up. And both
Mhm.
of those are things that as an artist, I go, yeah, that's good, right? But I'm not sure all managers would say that's good, right?
Speaks to a different kind of relationship to control. That if you're going to invoke the arts and you're going to invoke that sensory practicing, you have to be willing to allow for wherever that's going to take you.
Yeah, if you want to control people, you need to stay up in the intellectual area where you can control thoughts
Mm.
and set up rules and all. Once you get in there in the muddy, murky waters of actual sensory experience and let stuff go up, I think control is just an illusion. It's not, you don't have it. And frankly, as an artist, I wouldn't want to. For me, like if I'm working writing a play or as an academic, if I bring this into my article writing, if you want to if you think we're going to write this article X and we're just going to do that, well, that's not very interesting to me. If it's not like a voyage of discovery, if I actually know where we're headed, what's the point in going there?
Talking about spaces that we can't control, the subtitle of the handbook is provocatively framed as outrunning the bots in the human race. So I'm curious as AI increasingly takes on all of the cognitive and linguistic tasks that we're theoretically so good at in business. How do you think aesthetic judgment and sensory knowing and all the things that we've talked about are going to become more vital in the future of work?
Yeah, I think that becomes much more important, in that way that the really the sort of mundane work AI can do. And it's hard there's many ways in which say it's hard to imagine that many people find it meaningful to do the sort of work that AI can easily do for us. I think it pushes us to more meaningful work, which is often harder, but it pushes us more that individually, that the actual creative work. Can AI be creative? It means that this actually, you said judgment, aesthetic judgment. And I think that is the thing. That is the thing, judgment. And I would also use the word discernment. That is
Mm.
the thing that humans bring that I don't know that AI will ever be able to have. And when I say discernment, because I know, frankly, what I want in a leader. I want a leader who has perfect discernment. And what do I mean by that? What's the example of perfect discernment? Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes could walk into a room, look around and go, ah, clearly this person was from the Macon country because I can see that bit of brown mud on their pants, which there's only two places in the world where there's that color mud. And it couldn't have been this one for whatever reason. So that, or the dog that didn't bark, or the whatever it was, he notices the important bits of information and knows what it means. I mean, obviously,
Hmm.
none of us can actually do that perfectly, but that is the ultimate goal, the aspiration of discernment. And it requires this incredible mix of being able to select the important bits to know what's missing, to be able to know what they mean, to know which are the important bits and which aren't the important bits. It's a to me, it's the great, and it ties up with the other great question of leadership, which is, as a
Hmm.
leader, I'm trying to do this, is I'm trying to discern what's important out there. How do I know if I'm actually discerning something important or if I'm just projecting my own crap onto the world? In fact, this isn't really about what I'm seeing there. This is really all about my relationship with my mother.
It's a really interesting question. I'm pondering now uh, the degree to which AI will ultimately be better discerners than we are.
I don't think large language models, I don't think it's like can happen with large language models. Maybe
Hmm.
it's kind of the next step up with large world models, but I think large language models are such prediction machines and regress to the mean in such a way
Hmm.
that I don't think they will ever be good at, I don't think it's possible they can be good at discerning, because discerning is not just what is most probable here. It's what is the actually even the unlikely bit that's important. I think it's inherent in this sort of idea, but I think I mean, that one, but not all artificial intelligence is large language models.
No, it's true. As we wrap up this question, I wanna kind of use that last little bit that you said about the the most the what's the unlikely thing that we need to be paying attention to when it comes to aesthetic experience or the arts and meaningful work. What would be the number one piece of kind of guidance that you would give to people who are really interested in meaningful work about the unlikely place that artistic expression might be able to take them?
I think the unlikely thing would be, what would artistic expression of the mundane in our own quotidian existence, where will that take us? What insight will that give us in terms of meaningfulness of work? And there's kind of the Zen paradox that I can look for to do work that I find meaningful, that aligns with my values and all that sort of things, or I can find meaning in whatever work I do. Even if that work is emptying the dishwasher or painting buildings, I can find meaning in that by doing it
Mm,
well, by connecting to my craft and my experience of it, and working toward being continually appreciating it, maybe getting better at it, all those sorts of things. And I think there's the unlikely thing that we don't think about is, can we actually artistically engage? When I say artistically engage, I think I mean I would reduce that to sort of two practices. One, staying with your senses, and two, being willing to not know. To me, that's the essence of artful practice. I think every art practice out there teaches you in some form to be willing to not know and to stay with your senses. In that way, like drawing on the right side of the brain work teaches you to continue to look rather than to just rely on what you've already done. And can you do that with the most quotidian, boring, uninteresting parts of your work? And then when you do that, let it be expressed artistically and see where that
mm.
takes you. See if that doesn't, provide some all new insight.
Hmm. I think that's a great place to leave people. An inquiry, a homework assignment for every single person who's listening to this episode right now. If people want to know more about your work or potentially when the handbook comes out, tell us a little bit about when the handbook's coming out.
Well, it's in press right now. So my hope is sometime this spring, maybe April or May,
And
with Edward Elgar, the Research Handbook on Organizational Aesthetics. I'm not sure they're going to
beautiful.
let us have the subtitle we talked about.
We'll try. We'll push it. We recorded it here, so it's official somewhere. Thank you, Steve. I'm really grateful for your time today and for helping all of us think a little bit more deeply and sense a little bit more fully as to what meaningful work might be in our lives. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.